Okay guys, what's up? Welcome to today's video, which is going to be 6 differences between wildlife videography and wildlife stills photography. We're filming on the Viltrox lens, which I'm in love with, on the Fuji X-H2S. We are shooting this back in f-log because I wanted the lower ISO at 640. I stopped it down to 3.2 on the aperture, so this is not blown out here, and we didn't throw on an ND filter today. And as our first rule of the wildlife comparison, we are at a shutter speed of 48, which is double our frame rate. So that gets me to point number 1. When you're shooting wildlife video versus wildlife stills, one of the biggest things that you have to consider is how light and exposure is going to work, because it's going to be a lot different. So rule number 1, everybody screws this up, but you need to keep your shutter at twice whatever your frame rate is. So I'm going to do a video tomorrow on some of the basics for getting into wildlife videography. But if you're brand new and you have no idea what frames per second or compression or any of that stuff is, here's your rule of thumb. So 24 frames per second is usually your cinematic look. That's what TV and movies tend to be at. 30 frames per second, I guess it depends if you argue how different it looks, but a lot of people use them interchangeably. I typically shoot stuff like 24 for this, or I'll use 24 for wildlife if I need a lower shutter speed for more light. Because remember, you want double the shutter speed. So if I'm shooting at 24 frames per second right now, my shutter speed is 1/48th. If I was shooting at 30 frames per second, which is another normal way to shoot, then my shutter would be at 1/60th. Now, I don't know how much difference there's going to be between 48 and 60 for light, but it will be a little bit. So if you're trying to get in more light, this is where you may be hesitant to shoot slow motion. So slow motion in low light might be tricky, because if you're trying to shoot 120 frames per second, which is going to be 5 times slower than 24 frames per second, well, now your shutter needs to be 250. So at 250, you're losing several stops of light versus if you were shooting at 24 frames per second. So that's a big one. Now, the interesting thing is, remember, first and foremost, when you're shooting wildlife video versus stills, is there's no pixel peeping in video. So you're not going to take a picture and click on it 2 or 3 times and expand it to this big and look for feather details. You're trying to capture something sharp, stable, and you're trying to capture a moment. And yes, we're going to get the best image quality we can, and we're going to develop, and we're going to try to get better with our composition and lighting and stories. But for now, your image quality can be a little bit different. And that's why I would say, even if your camera only shoots 1080 instead of 4K, if you can do 1080 60 frames a second or 1080 120 frames per second for that slow motion, yeah, it's not going to be as crisp as 4K. But for now, use what you have, because it's still going to look good if you capture a cool moment. So the issue when you start getting into the light is, initially, if you go out early in the day or late at night, you're not going to have enough light to do stills a lot of the time, and you'll find that you have to get your shutter down so low. But imagine if someone could tell you, hey, you can shoot 600, 900 millimeters for stills and comfortably shoot at 1/50th of a shutter speed. That might sound really good to you, and that might be slower than you're used to shooting in stills. So in video, it's going to work a lot better, because you're also going to be on a tripod. That's going to be one of our golden rules. But shooting at 48 and this low shutter is going to let in a lot more light. Now here's the problem. That works to your disadvantage as the day goes on, because all of a sudden you're going to have too much light, and there's not really going to be much you can do about it. We already know you can't just start cranking your shutter, or your footage is going to take on a weird effect. And there could be artistic reasons to do that, but we're beginners. We're going to stay away from that. Your ISO, you're probably already shooting the lowest ISO you can, so you can't drop your ISO. So what's the only other way for you to raise your exposure? It's going to be tightening your aperture. And that's fine. I do that a lot, and that'll probably work. It's a good way to start working. But you'll quickly find that, if you're shooting at 48 shutter, even an aperture at 16, 18, or even 22 often will not give you a proper exposure. So you might be hesitant to tighten your aperture that small because of diffraction and things like that. Again, I think in video, I've personally never noticed in my own footage. Even when I have sharp, tight footage, I can't tell what aperture it was shot at in terms of sharpness. It's very different evaluating sharpness in moving images versus one frozen still. Now, I guess when you're talking about depth of field, that could be a different thing as well. But a lot of times in wildlife, you probably don't want that much depth of field. You're probably going to want your animal to be sharp, especially if you're filming, because as the animal's moving, whether you're trying to trust the spotty wildlife autofocus of the Fuji, which may or may not be working better, check that video out if you want to see how things are working. But even then, I think having a tight enough aperture that you can see your detail is going to be useful. So what can you do if you don't want to tighten your aperture? If you wanted to shoot it wide, let's say you've got a nice prime lens and you're shooting a subject with good separation, you really want to blur that background. Or if you've already tightened your aperture too much and there's nowhere else to go, it's going to get you into ND filters. And if you ever wonder why people use them in video, it's because a lot of the times you have to, because you can't just change your shutter. If you're shooting in the middle of the day and you need to tighten light, you just make your shutter really fast and you're not going to have any problem with it. In video, that's not going to be an option. So there's a couple of different things you can do in video. You can get something called a neutral density filter that's variable, which is going to let you turn it to give yourself a little bit more flexibility. Now, if you decide to go that route, make sure you get one that's decent quality, that doesn't give you any like weird color casts or anything like that. Typically, a filter that allows you to change and rotate options is going to have a little more of an impact on your image quality. Or you can just get a single filter that might be a 4-stop or an 8-stop filter, which is doing essentially what the name says, right? I was shooting today, if you go back and watch my video, I was shooting with a 10-stop ND filter, which is essentially reducing my exposure by 10 stops and then letting me bring it back up. Now, the reason I felt like I needed that when I was shooting earlier is because I wanted to shoot at 1.4 wide open in the middle of a very sunny day. So I'm letting a lot of light in, and my ISO and shutter speed, my shutter speed is also very low. My ISO is higher than I would normally pick it to be, and then my aperture starts messing things up. So that's where ND filters come in. If you want to save some money, you could just find a good ND filter, maybe a 6-stop or an 8-stop is probably where I'd start, and just get one. I would always rather have a heavier ND filter and increase my ISO a little bit than go the other way, especially if you're trying to be budget conscious. I think my 10-stop is a little heavy-handed, but I would say probably an 8 or a 6-stop is great. Once the sun comes up, you plop that on, and now you can continue to use your settings that you want. Any questions, please leave them below. That might be a lot, but I think it's important to remember that you can shoot in lower light with video than you can with stills a lot of the time, because you're also capturing movement, and even if your image quality is not quite as good, you've got a little bit more to work with there in terms of mood and story. But the flip side is true as well. When the image gets very harsh and the light gets harsh, it's going to be hard to actually expose properly if you're not using a filter. Now, the other thing, though, is a lot of people might not want to shoot at high noon with stills because the lighting is so bad your subject's going to be boring. And while I would rather shoot video in good lighting, I've taken lots of nice video at high noon because you're capturing the behavior. So yes, the lighting stinks and maybe even the composition's not always great, but if you're getting a nice, I was shooting the other day, I got some cool footage of a heron in the park, you're getting a nice heron in the marsh hunting, and you're getting that nice action shot and everything's working out. If the lighting's not great, you can kind of get away with it. So that's point one, the differences between lighting and how you need to think differently about them. I will often go out in the morning, and my workflow works like this. I'll often shoot video really early when it's too dark to get stills that I think I would keep. And then I'll transition to stills when the light gets perfect and I want that single moment captured. And then once the light starts being, before the light starts being harmful, but once it stops being magic, that's when I'll often go back to video. And then I might even continue video into the harsh light, depending. So for me, stills, there's very tight instances where I actually want to shoot stills, and I believe I'm going to get a still that is something I'll be proud of. Now, if I don't think I'm going to get a still that I'm really happy with, then I usually default to shooting video because I'd rather capture a cool moment with bad light than capture a still of a moment in bad light that just doesn't really convey what I'm after. So that's point one, lighting. Point number two, I already alluded to this, but a tripod is essentially essential. Essentially essential. That's not right. Maybe it is right. It is essential. You need a tripod. You have to shoot with a tripod. If you're shooting super slow motion and you're braced, you could get away with it. But no matter how stable you are, if the footage is shaky, it's never going to quite look like the professional job. Watch any of these behind-the-scenes documentaries, and I definitely encourage, if you haven't seen it, go on Netflix and the Our Planet documentary that came out 2 years ago maybe. They have an awesome behind the scenes series that'll show you the gear and techniques and how frustrating it can be. You won't feel like you're alone out there. But what's the one thing they all have in common? Tripod, 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 tripod. If you're trying to bring attention to your subject, you don't want to be moving the camera. You can do handheld video. The XH2S with a good lens has great stabilization, and I can walk around and vlog with it and feel good with the stability. But I'm not trying to focus on something. If I want my viewers' undivided attention on the subject, I don't want my camera wiggling, even if it's pretty controlled. And that's why it's really tough in the boat, because even when I'm stable and even when I'm on the tripod, the boat still moves. So you have to be really careful about your situations. But I would say probably don't jump into the boat right away. That's down the road. So step 1, lighting differences. Step 2, tripod is essential. Reach is step 3. So I think you can get away in video with shorter reach than you could in stills for one main reason and then one secondary reason. So my big reason is that when you're shooting video, you're trying to capture movement. So I was shooting the other day, and I was shooting a kingfisher, and the kingfisher was much too far for me to get a good picture. He was small in frame. You can't see any details. I just didn't see a photo there that made sense. But I knew that when he flew, he was going to fly in the direction he was looking, is what I was betting on. And I wanted to capture him flying and taking off. So I also shot it in slow motion to get all the glorious movement of when he moved. And having that wider frame made the video work a lot better when the still wouldn't. I often, even when I have the distance, I often find myself zooming out when shooting video, because unless I specifically want a really tight portrait, like right up here in your face, autofocus test? Unless I want it right up in your face, then I typically want to see some environment and see what's happening, and I want to see where the animal goes. And if you try tracking something like this and it goes like this, my hand only moved 6 inches. If my head moves 6 inches, you can see it's still in frame, right? So, I mean, if you're all the way back here and the head moves 6 inches, all of a sudden it's not that hard to track. So the more your subject is filling the frame, the harder it's going to be for you to follow your subject or set the scene when it does something. Now, the other part of reach is a lot of cameras, if you're shooting 4K, they have a built-in crop factor, which can be useful. A lot of times you might not want the crop factor shooting close in, and a lot of reviews will talk about crop factor as a negative. But I think if you're shooting wildlife video and you do want that reach, then the crop is nice. And if you're shooting on a zoom, even if it's cropping, you can just usually zoom yourself back out. So reach is a big difference, and I think having less of it is interesting in video. Might also even let you get some lenses out of the bag that you haven't shot with in a while. Maybe you have a fast, if you're shooting full frame, maybe you've got a 135 at a fast aperture that wouldn't normally do the trick, but all of a sudden in a city park or something, maybe that's close enough to get you something cool when you don't want to use your telephoto. So it's interesting. I think you can try a lot of different lenses in video that might not get you the still you're after. Okay, next, autofocus. This is a big one. So I have a video on the Fuji autofocus for wildlife and whether I trust it. And in summary, my findings are I'm currently working with new settings, and I think they're working for slow frame rates. So 24 and 30, or fast frame rates, I guess. 24 and 30, normal movement, just capturing normal life. I feel pretty good about the autofocus. Now, would I trust it for a really important moment I was waiting on? I don't think so. I would still rather have manual focus, because the difference is when you're manually focusing, nothing's going to happen quickly. So if the subject moves a little bit out of the focal plane, it's going to look a little more natural than the camera hunting trying to find it. And if it moves, you just get familiar and you just move your lens and rotate the ring and you're going to be fine. Manual focus, when you tell someone shooting stills the first time they go to video to shoot manual, it sounds crazy and they might look at you like you have two heads. But every camera I've seen, I don't trust any of them for autofocus. The R5 I don't think was any better for video autofocus than the Fuji for wildlife. And I've seen lots of reviews on other big cameras that even if they're a little better in the Fuji, even if they're a lot better for the Fuji, if I'm trying to capture something important, I don't want to trust autofocus. There's a reason why Hollywood studios use manual focus. I mean, you have more control, you have artistic expression in a way you don't have with autofocus. And I think if you're trying to work with a subject, it's nice to know that the camera is not going to fight you on that. Now, with that said, you do have a little bit of flexibility, especially, for example, if I'm shooting a bird in flight, I might use autofocus because it's really hard to track the bird while staying steady and focusing. So in a case like that, if I don't think I'm going to get it with manual focus, then I'll roll the dice and hope the autofocus does okay. Now, you never know. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. I find that slower shutter speeds exaggerate autofocus problems as well, or manual focus to that point, but I think manual you can react quicker. But the trouble is you have to think if you're shooting 120 frames per second, everything is 5 times slower. So if it took 1 second for the autofocus to get back on, now it takes 5 seconds. It's a big difference. Even though the camera is actually reacting the same speed in real life, you're seeing it take 5 times longer. So it's a lot more jarring. So again, if I'm shooting slow motion, always manual focus for me. But I would say if you're a beginner, unless you have a really good camera that's finely tuned for video autofocus, I would stick with manual and learn it. You're gonna have to learn it anyway. It's important. It's a good skill. 2 more points, and these are big differences. And let me backtrack, actually. So autofocus, I didn't talk about the difference. I only talked about why it's important. So autofocus, when you're shooting stills, is a lot different because you have a chance to screw up. So if you're shooting stills and you're shooting 30, 40 bursts and you're capturing a subject, it doesn't really matter if you miss a couple of frames, because especially at that burst, you're probably going to get one in focus that you want anyway. And you only need one, right? If you're trying to get a bird flying or striking something or posing, you only need that one frame that you're happy with. Now, sure, it's a drag if the autofocus drops right at the moment you need it. But in video, if the autofocus drops, the whole moment is ruined unless it drops and gets back on immediately. And even then, it's jarring enough that your viewer still saw the miss and they have to kind of mentally process that. In stills, you just pick the one that you like and use it. So when I'm shooting stills, I trust the Fuji autofocus system 10 out of 10, 100%. I have 0 issues with it. I have not had one case in the field in 6 weeks of using it, or the autofocus has cost me a still not one single time at all. Video is a different story. It's not been reliable for wildlife video to the point where I would trust it, and that's the big difference. In stills, you just cut your crap. In video, you're not going to film the bird flying and then right when he dives, you cut, and that's when it lost the focus. That's a big problem. So 2 more points. Video needs a bigger picture. So in stills, you're capturing one perfect moment, one beautiful image that just looks nice and does what you want. In video, you got to put a little more thought into what you're capturing. Now, if you're just trying to shoot a reel, then maybe you shoot a 30-second clip of something doing something cool, and that's it. But if you're trying to do anything narrative and you're trying to tell a story, then I think you have to do a little bit more work to think what you want. So for example, let's say you're shooting birds nesting at your house. You've got some robins. Maybe you get a clip focused on you see the branch where the mother lands as she builds the nest. So maybe you focus on the branch and you get the mother flying into frame. And then you keep filming and she flies out of frame. So now you've got, she flies in, then she flies out. Those are 2 separate cuts. Then in between, now you focus on the nest and you wait for her to fly into the nest and you film her coming in, doing some work in the nest, and then flying out of the nest. Well, now you have 4 shots, right? Flying into the branch, flying out, flying to the nest, working the nest, and then flying out. Actually, 5 shots. And then if you kept telling the story, you wait till she lays the eggs, and you get some footage of her on the eggs. Maybe you get some footage, there's bad weather, and she's incubating. Then you get the babies. Then you do the same. You get a footage of her hunting for worms. Then you get footage of her bringing the worm back and feeding the babies, and then leaving. And then lastly, maybe you get footage of her fledglings starting to leave the nest, and then maybe you film them when they're out and about. But you see where I'm going? It's the narrative. You have to have an idea. In stills, you don't have to work that hard. You just capture a moment. And maybe the moment does tell a story. I would say most wildlife moments don't. The good ones do, but I don't think most pictures get to that point. But they don't always have to. A good wildlife image doesn't always have to tell a story. Sometimes it's just a really beautiful photo. I think wildlife almost always has to tell something, unless it's a really awesome moment. But even then, it's kind of throwaway. And I'm not judging if you're just doing this for reels and you just want to capture quick moments. It's still the same principles. But even then, I think you have to figure out, if you're going to ask someone to watch something for 30, 60 seconds or 10 minutes or an hour, where's your narrative? Like, what's the story to draw somebody into watching this motion picture? Lastly, video is way more work. And I'm learning this by fire. I'm trying to YouTube a lot. I'm not doing this just to make content. Every video I put up at least starts in my head as an idea that I think will be a good one and one I want to tell. Some work better than others, and sometimes in the field I've gone out with plans to film behavior or film a species, and I thought I had great ideas and they don't work out. You're going to hit some, you're going to miss some. Video, though, will be a lot of work. I mean, even right now I'm looking at my card and it's saying I'm 20 minutes in, which means in 4K I've filled up probably 60 gigabytes of video talking to you for 20 minutes. So I'm going to go need to edit this, color grade it, process it, then upload it somewhere. I usually delete my vlog footage after it's on YouTube. I don't think I'm going to need to come back to it, but you're going to need to probably buy some hard drive space. You're going to need to get good with cleaning up files. So it's a lot easier to go out and shoot 2,000 or 3,000 photos and just dump them in a folder and ignore them, which gives me the chills because I like to go in and clean up files all the time and only keep what I want. But you can't just keep video. If you keep hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of clips, you're going to have a lot of storage, and most of us just don't have that. So in recap, the lighting's different. Think about the light. You're going to always want a tripod in video where a lot of us aren't using them at all for stills. Reach. You can afford to shoot wider in video and still have the clips you're looking for than stills. Autofocus is not something to be trusted in video most of the time. You need to think about your narrative when you're doing video, and you need to be prepared to do the editing, the work, and the storage work. And I think those so far in my first 6 weeks are the biggest differences I've noticed between wildlife videography and wildlife photography. Our next video is going to be on all the basics that you need to know about getting into wildlife video. And then the third video in this intro series is going to be a crash course on DaVinci Resolve and how to use DaVinci Resolve for your beginner work. So how to edit your first video. So that's what's coming soon. Thanks for the support. Like and subscribe if you're having fun here. And again, anyone who stuck this out, this is the Viltrox. So it's doing a pretty good job on the autofocus, and yeah, no filters. So we're good. We're back to image quality.